Pelican Bay and ADX Florence revealed untold stories of inmates and guards in America's worst Supermax prisons. Shadows behind the walls. If you think you know what goes on inside America's toughest prisons, think again. Hit subscribe now because the secrets you're about to hear have been pulled from lawsuits, affidavits, and real reports, and they'll change everything you thought you knew. The story begins on a fog-laden morning along California's remote north coast. Pelican Bay State Prison rises from the mist like a concrete shipwreck, its perimeter lined with gun towers and coils of razor wire. Inside the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, a long windowless corridor runs between rows of sealed cells. It smells of disinfectant and damp concrete. Guards walk slowly, boots echoing. Cameras watch from the corners. Inmates rarely speak. Here, some men have spent 20 years without touching another human being. But on this day, tension hangs thicker than usual. At 9:37 a.m., an alarm sounds in Yard C. Two rival gang members have been released from their cells into the same exercise pen. A controlled release, the official term. Witnesses later allege it wasn't an accident. Lawsuits will call it a gladiator fight. Guards rush in as fists fly and shouts echo. Pepper spray clouds the air. By the time it's over, one man is on the ground bleeding from a puncture wound, another being dragged away in restraints. Paperwork will say, altercation between inmates. In court, it will become Exhibit A in Madrid versus Gomez, the landmark case that condemns Pelican Bay's use of excessive force and long-term isolation. Hundreds of miles away in the high desert of Colorado, another fortress rises, the Administrative Maximum Facility at Florence, ADX. From above, it forms a giant X, each wing a sealed world. Here live the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, 1993 World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef, cartel leaders, spies, and gang shot callers transferred from state prisons like Pelican Bay. They spend 23 hours a day alone in concrete cells, their mail photocopied, their phone calls transcribed. Even exercise happens in a small concrete pen known as the Dog Run, open only to a strip of sky. At 10:05 a.m. Mountain Time, inside ADX's mailroom, a correctional officer scans an envelope addressed to a Denver law firm. The sender is an inmate transferred from California, a man who once organized hunger strikes inside Pelican Bay's SHU. The envelope passes the X-ray and chemical test. Inside is a single sheet of legal paper filled with tiny handwritten numbers and arrows. The officer logs it as legal mail and sends it on, unaware it contains a coded map of service corridors and fiber optic lines beneath ADX, a map drawn from memory and smuggled blueprints. In Sacramento, civil rights attorney Rosa Vega has been fighting Pelican Bay conditions for 2 decades. She represented Vaughn Dortch, the mentally ill inmate scalded in 1992 while handcuffed in a hot water tub. Dortch survived with severe burns, and photos of his injuries became symbols of prison reform. Now Vega is preparing a new class action suit, this time aimed at federal conditions at ADX. She's heard whispers of contraband networks and hidden channels of communication even in the most secure facility. But no one has shown her proof. Until today. At 1:12 p.m., Vega receives the coded sheet from the Denver law firm. She spreads it out on her desk, recognizing the hand that drew it. She overlays it on an old construction diagram of ADX found in public records. The numbers line up perfectly with sealed maintenance spaces built in the early 1990s and never officially used. Her heart races. She knows who sent it, and what he's trying to expose. If he's right, the Bureau of Prisons is sitting on a vulnerability that undermines its entire narrative of control. Back at Pelican Bay, guards make their rounds. In one cell sits a man who helped smuggle out the documents. He has been in the SHU since the early 2000s, labeled a gang associate, denied normal parole hearings. He stares at a small TV bolted high on the wall playing a news segment about ADX. For the first time in years, a faint smile crosses his face. His note has reached its destination. As night falls over the Rockies, ADX Florence shifts to lockdown mode. Lights dim, doors seal, cameras switch to infrared. In a cell in the special security unit, the transferred inmate lies awake, counting the seconds between camera sweeps. He has nothing but time, and a plan he believes can change the narrative of 2 prisons at once. At 11:43 p.m., a technician in ADX's control room notices a 4-second glitch on one of the basement cameras. He logs it as minor outage. He doesn't see the faint outline of a man moving in the shadows of an unused corridor, or the small flash of a contraband phone taking a photograph. The next morning, Rosa Vega opens her email to find an anonymous photo attachment. A grainy image of a dim concrete tunnel lined with cables, taken from inside ADX. Across the bottom of the photo are 4 words in block letters: Phase 2 begins tomorrow. Phase 2. Rosa Vega stared at the grainy photo glowing on her laptop screen, the words Phase 2 begins tomorrow, stamped like a thread across the bottom. She had spent her career parsing affidavits and depositions, but nothing like this had ever landed in her inbox. If the picture was real, someone inside ADX had managed to photograph a sealed corridor and transmit it out, an impossible act in the most tightly controlled prison in America. She shut the laptop, grabbed her briefcase and booked the first flight to Denver. Hours later, high over the Rockies, the plane shuddered in turbulence. Rosa clutched the armrest, mind racing. Vaughn Dortch, the hunger strikes, the endless hearings, she'd seen how secrecy protected abuse. If ADX had hidden channels, they weren't just a security risk. They were a symbol of the system's arrogance. She thought of the man who'd sent her the coded sheet, a former Pelican Bay SHU organizer she'd once represented, now transferred to Florence. If he was risking everything to get this evidence out, she couldn't ignore it. At ADX, Lieutenant Mark Harris was already on edge. The previous night's camera glitch in the sub-basement wasn't the first. For 3 days, sensors had flickered and recovered, too brief to trigger alarms. The special security unit was supposed to be airtight. Harris had worked Pelican Bay before coming to Florence. He'd seen controlled releases go wrong, contraband smuggled in through legal mail, even coded orders sent to the yard. But here there were no yards, no contact. And yet something was happening. When Rosa arrived at the outer checkpoint, snow crunching under her boots, Harris met her in the lobby. She showed him the photo. His jaw clenched. "That's our sub-level," he said quietly. "No inmate should even know it exists." He agreed to take her below under the guise of a maintenance inspection. "But you didn't get this from me," he warned. They descended a narrow stairwell to sub-level C. The air grew colder, heavier. Pipes ran overhead, dripping condensation. Harris unlocked a rusted door at the end of a corridor. Inside was a low, dusty space filled with abandoned cable spools. On the far wall, faint footprints led to a secondary hatch. "We sealed this after September 11th, Harris said. "Nobody's supposed to be down here." Rosa crouched, running her finger along the prints. They were fresh. "Someone's been here," she whispered. Harris radioed for a motion sweep. Static answered. He tried again. Nothing. The signal was dead. Meanwhile, in the special security unit, the transferred inmate, known to Rosa as Luis but listed in bureau records as inmate 93417-002, sat cross-legged on his bunk. He had folded another message into his legal papers, disguised as case notes. Years of isolation at Pelican Bay had taught him patience. Now inside ADX he had found a fault line. Not a tunnel for escape but a way to expose the system itself. If Rosa could get the images out, if the press could publish them, the myth of absolute control would crack. Back in the corridor, Harris pried open the hatch. A narrow passage sloped downward, lined with conduit and cables. The floor was damp. "This wasn't on my blueprints," he muttered. Rosa's flashlight beam swept over graffiti on the wall. A raven sketched in black marker, the same symbol from the coded sheet she'd received. She snapped a photo. Harris hissed, "No phones down here." She ignored him. Upstairs, a technician monitoring ADX's outgoing mail flagged a legal envelope addressed to Rosa's firm. Inside was a single phrase in block letters, "The foundation is yours now." He set it aside for inspection, but in the chaos of a shift change, it was sent out anyway. Harris and Rosa emerged from the sub-basement shaken. "What happens now?" she asked. Harris looked at her, eyes tired. "Now we pretend we didn't see it while I try to find who's doing this before my career ends." That night, Rosa checked into a motel outside Florence. Snow drifted past the window. She opened her laptop to review the photos she'd taken. As she scrolled, a new email appeared from an anonymous sender. This time it wasn't a picture, it was a list of names. Guards, contractors, and lawyers who had worked at both Pelican Bay and ADX over the past 2 decades. Next to some names were symbols, a raven, a key, a lightning bolt. She didn't know what they meant, but she recognized several. They were people she'd deposed, people who had denied knowledge of abuse under oath. Inside ADX, Luis unfolded a new sheet of graph paper under the dim light. Hidden in the numbers was a message, the date and time of the next hunger strike, not in California this time, but among selected inmates at Florence. He whispered to himself the names of men still buried in Pelican Bay's SHU. "Phase 2, he said softly. "They can't ignore us now." At 4:06 a.m. as Rosa's motel clock ticked, her phone buzzed again. This time the anonymous email contained a live video feed, a grainy blue-tinted CCTV view of ADX's subbasement. In the corner of the frame, a hooded figure moved past the camera carrying a stack of files. Across the feed flashed a single line of text. Phase 3 begins at dawn. The foundation cracks. Snow hammered the high desert at dawn, wind whipping across the razor wire. Inside ADX Florence the corridors hummed with tension. Control room monitors flickered as if under stress. For 3 nights, unexplained glitches had hit sublevel C. Now, a live feed was leaking to the outside world. In her motel room, Rosa Vega watched the anonymous stream on her laptop, a blue-tinted CCTV view of the sealed corridor. A hooded figure moved past the camera carrying a stack of files. Across the bottom flashed the words, Phase 3 begins at dawn. She grabbed her coat and badge, jumped into her rental car and sped toward the prison. Inside ADX, Lieutenant Harris barked orders at staff. Lock every sally port. No one in or out without my say-so. Technicians scrambled to isolate the rogue feed but found their own systems had been mirrored. Everything visitor logs, use of force reports, contractor lists, was already being copied to an external server. Harris stared at the screen. We're not looking at an escape. We're looking at a leak. By the time Rosa cleared security, the warden was in full crisis mode. She showed him the feed. This is already out, she said. If you try to bury it, you'll just prove them right. Harris motioned her to follow. We're going down, he said grimly. They descended to sublevel C with a tactical team. The sealed corridor was colder than before, the sound of dripping water echoing like a metronome. In the center of the passage stood a makeshift hub, a battery-powered router and a small server humming quietly, wires spliced into the prison's fiber trunk. A handwritten sign taped to the casing read, "The foundation is yours now." Rosa snapped photos while Harris examined the device. "Where's the inmate?" he demanded. A guard replied, "He's in his cell." But as they reached the special security unit, they found the cell empty. The bed was made. On the desk lay a single sheet of paper covered in tiny grid numbers. At the bottom, in block letters, "Every wall has a fault line." Alarms blared. Staff sealed the wing. Harris called for a head count. Minutes later, 2 officers escorted Luis, inmate 93417-002, into the control room in cuffs. He had been in a secure interview booth the whole time. He hadn't left. The feed was still streaming. Rosa looked at him. "How?" she asked. Luis met her eyes. "Isolation breeds ingenuity. You taught us to be invisible. We learned to be everywhere." While Harris interrogated him, journalists across the country received a data trove labeled Pelican Bay and ADX Florence revealed. It contained sealed affidavits from Madrid versus Gomez, photos of Vaughn Dortch's scalding injuries, hunger strike declarations, and internal ADX memos about mental health neglect and contraband. For the first time, the public saw behind the walls of both prisons at once. In Washington, headlines blared, "Supermax secrets leak, Pelican Bay and ADX under fire." Lawmakers demanded hearings. Families of prisoners held vigils. Civil rights groups called for independent inspections of federal and state isolation units. The myth of perfect control cracked. Back in Florence, Harris shut down the server. The feed went dark. He turned to Luis. "What did you get out of this?" he demanded. Luis said quietly, "A voice." Rosa stepped forward. "You realize this will trigger investigations, lawsuits, maybe reforms?" Luis nodded. "That's the point. We're not ghosts anymore." 2 weeks later, Rosa testified before a Senate subcommittee holding up a printed frame from the leaked video. The dim corridor, the hooded figure, the words Phase 3. She described decades of documented abuse and secrecy at Pelican Bay and ADX. She described the hunger strikes, the lawsuits, the psychological toll of indefinite isolation. "This isn't just about one inmate," she said. "It's about a system that thrives in darkness." Luis was moved to an undisclosed facility, cut off from outside contact. The Bureau of Prisons launched an internal review. California officials reopened files on Pelican Bay. Journalists pored over the leaks. For the first time in years, the men inside the SHU felt their voices carried beyond concrete walls. Months later, a plain envelope arrived on Rosa's desk. Inside was a map of another prison and a single line of text. "Every fortress has a fault line. Phase 4 is yours." She stared at it, the city buzzing outside her window. Somewhere, someone was still building a way to pierce the walls. If you thought this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the next set of walls begins to crack.